United States Army wrote this man up for the Medal of Honor 3 separate times in 13 months. Not 3 medals for a whole career. 3 nominations for 3 different actions inside about a single year of fighting. A rate of nominations so unusual that only a small handful of American service members in the nation's entire history have ever matched it. Most of what he actually did during that stretch is permanently lost to history, because the missions were so classified that the paperwork documenting them was deliberately destroyed after the war ended. His name was Robert Howard. By the time he retired, more than one historian of Army Special Forces had called him, flatly, the most decorated American soldier who ever lived. Everything that follows comes from his official Medal of Honor citation, U.S. Army records, and corroborating news coverage and military history sources. Where a detail comes only from his own retelling or from secondary Special Forces histories, rather than an official record, I'll flag it as such. Robert Lewis Howard was born July 11, 1939, in Opelika, Alabama, and grew up near Fort Benning, Georgia, close enough that military convoys passing by his childhood home were simply part of the local scenery. His own father and one of his uncles had served as paratroopers in the 101st Airborne Division, and by his own later account, it was the sight of paratrooper wings on soldiers' caps that first planted the idea in his head that he wanted to jump out of airplanes for a living someday, just like they had. Growing up in that environment, surrounded by relatives who'd already served, gave him a fairly clear sense from an early age of exactly which direction his own life was going to go. He enlisted in the Army in Montgomery, Alabama, on July 20th, 1956, a month after graduating high school, at 17 years old. His early career gave him almost none of what he'd actually signed up for. Assigned as a mechanic based on his prior work experience, he spent his first years in service in a motor pool rather than anywhere near combat, and by his own admission, drifted for a while, drinking too much, coasting, rather than building any kind of serious military career. A sergeant eventually pulled him aside and warned him plainly that he'd be pushed out at his next re-enlistment if he didn't get serious. Howard took the warning to heart, cleaned himself up, married a woman named Tina, and when his re-enlistment came up, negotiated a deal, 6 more years, in exchange for a guaranteed slot at jump school. The Army agreed. He earned his wings and was assigned as a parachute rigger and supply sergeant with the 101st Airborne Division, his own father's old outfit. Along the way, still years before anyone was writing him up for medals, Howard also found time to earn an associate's degree in business administration from the University of Maryland, completed in 1962, largely through off-duty coursework. By the mid-1960s, with a young daughter at home, Howard deployed to Vietnam for the first time. He was still, on paper, a supply sergeant, not infantry, not special forces, nowhere near the kind of unit that saw sustained direct combat. That changed abruptly during an ambush that caught his unit's leadership completely off guard. With the officer in charge frozen and unable to issue orders, Howard reportedly took the initiative himself, asked to be assigned a section of the perimeter to defend, and while setting up his position, was shot through the face, the round passing through his cheek and mouth, knocking out several teeth. It would not be the last time in his career that a wound to the face failed to slow him down for long. He recovered in a field hospital, alongside, by coincidence, an old friend from airborne training, who'd since become a Green Beret. When that friend's Special Forces colonel came to collect him, the friend mentioned Howard to the colonel directly, suggesting they could use a man like him in the field. Howard, still recovering from a gunshot wound to the face, said he'd take anything that got him closer to the actual fighting. Months later, with no formal Special Forces training whatsoever, Howard found himself flown to Saigon and offered a role with the Studies and Observations Group, MACV-SOG, a covert unit operating directly under the authority of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and, ultimately, the White House itself, running missions into Laos and Cambodia at a time when the U.S. government would not publicly admit American forces were operating in either country. SOG's existence remained officially unacknowledged by Washington for decades after the war ended, and its operators worked in small, mixed American and indigenous teams, deep behind what were technically neutral borders. He was told plainly what that meant: no identifying insignia, extremely high casualty rates, and if he was killed or captured, the government would deny any knowledge of his presence there at all. Howard volunteered anyway. He spent roughly the next 6 months as what SOG operators called a strap hanger, an extra volunteer brought along on missions to help carry equipment, radios, and extra ammunition, filling in wherever a team needed one more capable body, without necessarily having a permanent slot on any single team. Almost none of what he did during that stretch is independently documented today. SOG's own records from this period were largely destroyed after the war, and Howard never kept a personal journal of his own. What we do know for certain, because it required no classified details to award, is that he saw enough direct combat during this time to be awarded the Combat Infantryman Badge, a decoration reserved specifically for soldiers who've personally engaged the enemy in active ground combat, and one of the few honors from this entire stretch of his service that survives in any official record at all. Howard returned stateside in 1966 to complete formal Special Forces training, earning his Green Beret by the end of 1967, and went straight back to Vietnam, attached to a SOG forward operating base positioned near the tri-border junction of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, ideal terrain for rapid cross-border operations. Even with his Green Beret now earned, he initially struggled to get assigned to actual missions. Nobody wanted to risk bringing an unproven man on the most dangerous operations SOG ran. SOG's operators, by multiple accounts, looked nothing like the rest of the conventional military around them. Beards, civilian clothing, no visible rank or unit insignia, a deliberately unmilitary appearance that let them blend into the terrain and populations they were operating among. Howard, by contrast, reportedly stayed clean-shaven and squared away in appearance for essentially his entire career, even after he'd become one of the most respected operators on the base. Once he finally got the chance to prove himself in the field, though, accounts from the men who served alongside him consistently describe him going from the untested newcomer to the operator specifically requested by name for the riskiest jobs available. Over the following 13 months, Howard's actions in the field earned him 3 separate nominations for the Medal of Honor, an extraordinary rate by any measure, especially for a single stretch of a single tour, made even more unusual by what happened to each nomination afterward. Because so many of these operations took place in Cambodia and Laos, countries the United States was not supposed to have combat forces in at all, official recognition had to be handled carefully, since a public Medal of Honor citation requires publishing a detailed account of exactly where and how an action took place. His first Medal of Honor nomination was downgraded to a Distinguished Service Cross rather than approved outright. The classified nature of the mission itself made the level of public disclosure a full Medal of Honor citation demanded politically impossible at the time. His second and third nominations, for 2 separate actions fought close together in that same window, were submitted almost simultaneously. One was approved as the actual Medal of Honor. The other was downgraded to a Silver Star. The action that finally earned Howard his Medal of Honor took place on December 30th, 1968, in Cambodia. By then, a sergeant first class, serving as platoon sergeant of a mixed American and South Vietnamese platoon, Howard was second in command of a hatchet force-sized element, on a mission to rescue a specific missing American soldier, Robert Sheridan, believed to be held somewhere in enemy-controlled territory. The platoon had barely moved out from its helicopter landing zone when it was hit by an estimated two-company enemy force, several hundred men against a platoon a fraction of that size. In the opening minutes of that ambush, Howard was wounded, and a grenade explosion destroyed the weapon in his hands entirely. According to multiple secondary accounts of the battle, drawn from interviews and later Special Forces histories, the blast also left him temporarily blinded by his own blood and briefly unconscious. His official citation describes what happened next in careful, understated military language. Seeing his platoon leader seriously wounded and exposed to enemy fire, Howard, unable to walk properly and now without a working weapon, crawled through the direct line of enemy fire to reach him. While Howard was administering first aid and trying to strip away the lieutenant's combat equipment, an enemy round struck one of the ammunition pouches on the officer's belt, detonating several loaded magazines at close range. Howard took cover momentarily, then went right back to dragging the badly wounded officer toward the rest of the scattered platoon. Through what the citation calls his outstanding example of indomitable courage, Howard managed to rally the disorganized platoon back into an effective defensive position, crawling from man to man under fire to render first aid, direct return fire, and hold the perimeter together. For 3.5 hours, Howard's small platoon and the aircraft supporting them held off repeated enemy assaults across dense, unfamiliar terrain deep inside hostile territory, until the position was finally stable enough for rescue helicopters to attempt a landing under fire. Howard personally supervised loading his wounded men aboard those helicopters, and by every account, did not board one himself until every other man on that landing zone was safely aboard first. By multiple corroborating accounts, he actually learned he'd been approved for the Medal of Honor over a two-way radio, in the middle of this same firefight, immediately after being wounded, one of 8 separate Purple Hearts he'd eventually be awarded across his career. Beyond the bare citation, Special Forces oral histories and later biographical accounts, including interviews Howard gave later in life, and Stephen Moore's 2024 biography, drawing on family records and declassified material, add considerably more color to episodes from these same 13 months. A red-painted footlocker packed with explosives and left as bait for enemy trackers, a claymore mine rigged and thrown into the back of an enemy troop truck, a tense standoff with an enemy soldier carrying a flamethrower, the two men locking eyes before the enemy soldier chose to withdraw rather than risk a grenade Howard was holding with the pin already pulled. These specific stories are consistently repeated across serious Special Forces histories, though they come from personal recollection rather than official citations, so I'll present them as part of the wider legend around Howard, rather than independently verified fact in the same way the Medal of Honor citation itself is. Wounded 14 separate times across 54 months of combat duty in Vietnam, Howard was awarded 8 Purple Hearts in total, alongside 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, a Silver Star, the Defense Superior Service Medal, 4 Legions of Merit, and 4 Bronze Stars with Valor device, a decoration record that multiple military historians, including John Plaster in his History of MACV-SOG, have described as making Howard, in Plaster's own words, the most highly decorated American soldier in the nation's history. Historians and journalists covering his story have repeatedly drawn the comparison to World War II's Audie Murphy. The two men, a generation apart, standing as the most decorated combat soldiers of their respective wars, though Howard's record remained classified and largely unknown to the public for years, after Murphy had already become a household name and a movie star. For his actions and leadership under fire, Howard received a direct appointment from Master Sergeant to First Lieutenant in December 1969, skipping the standard officer candidate pipeline entirely in recognition of what he'd already proven in the field. He continued taking on demanding assignments throughout the rest of his career, even after already holding the nation's highest award for valor, a pattern of continuing to seek out difficult, hands-on responsibilities, rather than coasting on his reputation that colleagues consistently pointed to as genuinely characteristic of the man. Howard formally received the Medal of Honor from President Richard Nixon during a ceremony in the White House's East Ballroom on March 2, 1971. His wife, Tina, and his two daughters, Melissa and Denicia, flew in to be there with him. By his own later account, given decades afterward to the Congressional Medal of Honor Society's Oral History Project, Howard felt genuinely faint standing in front of the president that day, and told Nixon so directly, apologizing, in the moment, for how pale he must have looked. Nixon, apparently concerned, asked if he was all right. Howard later said that as the medal was placed around his neck, his mind went to several of his own uncles who had served, 3 of whom died, in the Second World War, and that receiving the nation's highest award felt, in that moment, like something he was sharing with them rather than something that belonged to him alone. He never returned to combat duty in Vietnam after that, spending the remainder of his military career in training and leadership roles, instructing airborne soldiers, infantry, and fellow Rangers, passing along exactly the kind of hard-won field judgment that can't be taught from a manual. Notably, despite already holding the nation's highest award for valor, Howard went on to complete Ranger School himself in 1973, graduating as the distinguished honor graduate of his class. He went on to command a company in the storied 2nd Ranger Battalion at Fort Lewis, Washington, served as a mountain ranger training instructor in the late 1970s, later ran Special Forces training at Camp McCall in North Carolina, and was recognized as Outstanding Infantry Officer of his class at the Army's Command and General Staff College, before eventually completing the National War College as well. Howard retired from the United States Army in 1992 after 36 years of total service at the rank of full colonel. Robert Lewis Howard died of pancreatic cancer on December 23, 2009, at a hospice in Waco, Texas, at 70 years old. He was survived by 4 children and 5 grandchildren. His funeral was held at Arlington National Cemetery on February 22, 2010, in Section 7A, a section of the cemetery where more than a dozen other Medal of Honor recipients are also laid to rest. His name has continued to attach itself to the institutions that trained him. In April 2017, the Army dedicated a building at the Rowe Training Facility on Camp McCall, the same grounds where Howard once ran Special Forces training himself, as Howard Hall. In 2021, Special Operations Command Korea unveiled a plaque dedicating its own headquarters campus in his honor. Some accounts describe him as the only American soldier ever nominated for the Medal of Honor, 3 separate times for 3 distinct actions. Others note that 2 other historical figures, Marine Corps legend Dan Dailey and General Douglas MacArthur, were also nominated 3 times across their careers. What isn't disputed is that no other American soldier has matched the sheer density of Howard's combat decorations, earned across a stretch of barely 13 months. In his retirement, Howard spent much of his time working directly with fellow veterans, an area of his life that by several accounts, he took every bit as seriously as his combat record, including reportedly pushing back hard, more than once, against superiors and bureaucracy on behalf of disabled veterans he felt weren't getting the support they'd earned, an advocacy that friends and colleagues later credited with helping push improvements through the Department of Veterans Affairs during a period when Vietnam veterans in general were still fighting for basic recognition. He took periodic trips to visit active duty troops serving in Iraq well into his later years. A man who'd spent 13 months of his own war being written up for the nation's highest award 3 separate times, still showing up, decades later, for the soldiers who came after him. Within the modern Special Forces community, Howard's reputation extends well beyond his official paperwork. Fellow SOG veterans and later oral histories describe a man who simply didn't register fear the way other people did, and who treated the most dangerous missions available as routine work rather than something to be dreaded or avoided. One SOG team leader who repeatedly brought Howard along on operations reportedly described him afterward in blunt terms, that he never once saw the man show any hesitation at all, that whatever you asked of him, he simply did it, without complaint and without apparent concern for his own safety. It's the kind of reputation that doesn't show up on an official citation, but that every serious history of MACV-SOG's operators mentions all the same. The quiet consensus among the men who actually served alongside him that Robert Howard genuinely was as fearless in practice as his paperwork made him sound on paper.